in the year 250 AD. And what we are looking at here is the Aramaic-speaking regions of the Near East. But what we also see is that it's not a homogeneous cultural ethnic area. In the East, all official documents were in Aramaic language. In the West, Greek was the official language. But still, as I have just mentioned, the Syro-Aramaic language, the Aramaic traditions and schools of thought form the basis of the entire region. In the West, we had the Roman Empire, and in the East, we had the Sassanid Empire. In the brighter areas, we have evidence of Christian settlements, but those Christians would have been few and far between. So the Christians of the time were still mainly clustered around those population centers near the Mediterranean and up there in Armenia. And of course, many of those Christians were Aramaic speakers. Large portions of the early Christian literature was written in the bilingual Western Syrian regions, usually first in Greek, but then quickly translated into Aramaic. Still in the middle of the 3rd century, what is also important to note is that there were constant wars between the Roman Empire and the Sassanid Empire. And one element of those wars were deportations. And particularly the Persians loved to deport people and to increase their population with deportees. One extreme example was under the Sassanid king Shapur I, who deported hundreds of thousands of people from the Roman Empire into the Sassanid Empire. 325, and that's when the Council of Nicaea took place. And the importance of the council is, of course, that the Trinitarian Christology was adopted in the church throughout the Roman Empire, which means that Arians and anti-Trinitarians were now formally out of communion with the Catholic Church, and they could no longer work from within the church. As a result, many of those anti-Trinitarian Christians who lived within this Aramaic-speaking area that we've just seen moved from the Roman Empire into the Sassanid Empire, which wasn't much of a cultural shift for them. It was one big cultural area, but they could keep their anti-Trinitarian beliefs and practices. The year 410 AD, the Council of Seleucia-Ctesiphon, which was sort of the Persian equivalent to the Council of Nicaea. It marked the unification of the Church of the East, which is also known as the Nestorian Church, and which became the state church of the Sassanid Empire. In those purple areas, we would find strong Christian communities. The Council of Seleucia-Ctesiphon formally adopted Nicaea, so now the Church of the East also was Trinitarian, which of course the anti-Trinitarians in those regions didn't like very much. The year 600, and this is right at the brink of the important events that kick everything off. And once again, we want to look at the spread of Christianity, and we can see how the situation has changed from the first time we looked at this map in 250. 602, and this is when the last war between the Sassanid Empire and the Byzantine Empire started. In 608, another civil war breaks out within the Byzantine Empire. By 610, Heraclius defeats Phocas and becomes emperor. By 613, Khosrow II had conquered Syria. In 614, he takes Jerusalem, destroys the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and steals the True Cross, which was a major blow for Christianity at the time. And by 615, the Persians reach Chalcedon, which is right across the Bosporus Strait from Constantinople. So they could see Constantinople from where they were. In 619, Khosrow II conquers Alexandria, and all of Egypt is under Persian control by 621. In 622, Heraclius had a decisive victory against the Sassanids. In fact, it was the very first victory in the 20 years since the war started, but it was a really important one. What Heraclius does instead is he comes to an agreement with the strongest forces that are left now in those lands, and those were the Arabs. So now we have here a mixture of Arabs who've already been there, like the Ghassanids, and of Arabs who've just recently arrived, and Heraclius made them into clients. Just like the Ghassanids, now there were lots of Arab tribes who became Byzantine clients, which means that they would respect the central authority of the emperor in Constantinople, but all they needed to do is to keep the land safe, to be open for trade with the Byzantine Empire, and to provide troops when called upon. Other than that, they were basically autonomous. And 641 is the year when Emperor Heraclius dies. And what happens immediately after his death is that these Arab clients now start to mint their own coins. And that is a sure sign that they no longer respect the central authority. And in fact, Heraclius was so revered among the Arabs that there are even fables of the Prophet Muhammad writing letters to him. They wanted to connect the Prophet to the Emperor Heraclius because Heraclius was such a revered person. Now, 10 years later, and what we see is the final collapse of the Sassanid Empire. And the traditional story is that starting with the Rashidun caliphs, the Muslim armies invaded Persia and conquered it by 651. By 662, Muawiyah is elected Amir al-Mu'minin. That would be the commander of the faithful. We have the commander of the faithful, who in the one hand holds a spear, which is a symbol for the protection. He is protecting something. The other hand rests on a head in a vessel, and that head is obviously the head of John the Baptist, which is indicated by a staff that is descending on the right of the coin, harkening back to the story in the Bible with the Holy Spirit descending upon Jesus during the baptism. And on the right, next to the spear, we have some Christian symbolism. Again, we have a palm leaf and a cross. Coins like this were, of course, important because coins were the main means of distributing propaganda. There was no social media, no newspapers, TV, radio, nothing. But the one thing that everybody looked at every day was, of course, coins. And this coin in particular is intended to proclaim the legitimacy of Muawiyah's or his successor's rule based upon his protection of this important sanctuary. And that year is, of course, 622, when Muhammad supposedly fled from Mecca to Medina. But as we've seen just a few slides before, 622 was an important year for a quite different reason. And that is because in 622, the Arabs gained their independence, which is the actual reason why 622 is the year according to the Arabs. It's their independence from the Byzantines on one side and the Persians on the other side. When you have a new empire, the old one always becomes the enemy. That's just in the nature of things. Now, one of the most important monuments built in those days is, of course, the Dome of the Rock, which is completed in 694 under Abd al-Malik. And it is important for several reasons. For one, it's the first monumental structure which is built by the Arabs. It is built in the tradition of Syrian Byzantine churches. The architecture is just like previous churches built in that area. And what is important for us today is the inscription on the inside walls. So that's the original inscription, which was commissioned by Abd al-Malik. It was later restored by al-Mamun, who added the diacritical marks. But initially, this inscription was without any dots, just like the original Quran manuscripts. And not only do we see the oldest references to some verses in the Quran, what we also see here is that clearly Abd al-Malik was an anti-Trinitarian Christian and that the word Muhammad was used to describe Jesus. In this inscription, Jesus is identified as the praised one, and the praised one literally translates to Muhammad. In 756, the so-called tomb of the Prophet is built in Medina, but initially that's not what it was. It was a Christian sanctuary. We don't know exactly what for or why it was built, but what we do know is that this is the last inscription where Jesus is referred to as the Muhammad. So we've seen that in the Dome of the Rock. We also have this on some coins, which I didn't go into here. So we do have coins even earlier than the inscription of the Dome of the Rock, where we have Christian symbolism and then the word Muhammad, clearly referring to Jesus as the praised one. And we also have this on the tomb of the Prophet in Medina for the last time. So every other inscription that we know of that came after 756, if there is Muhammad mentioned, it's referring to the Prophet Muhammad, no longer to Jesus as the praised one. If you remember, in 250 AD, Aramaic was spoken throughout the Near East. By 850, it's barely spoken anymore. And the reason is that starting with Abd al-Malik, a strict Arabization policy was implemented. And now Arabic was the lingua franca. Arabic was the language that everybody had to learn in addition to their native language. So Aramaic really was now reduced to those areas where it remained the native language of the people. And this also explains why we have so many misreadings of the Quran. If you remember in the episode we did about Christoph Luxemburg, he identified lots of Aramaic words in the Quran. And while Aramaic was still the lingua franca, people had a chance of identifying them. But now, since the majority does no longer speak Aramaic, but only Arabic, they couldn't correctly understand those texts anymore. So for example, they didn't understand anymore that qur'an are grapes in paradise, and they didn't understand anymore that Muhammad means the Blessed One and was a title applied to Jesus. Pre-Nicene anti-Trinitarian Christian religion tips over into the new religion called Islam, because it was under Al-Mamun that a lot of these readings of the Quran that we are now familiar with were fixed. He added the diacritical marks on the inscription in the Dome of the Rock. He therefore fixed the reading of Muhammad as the prophet and no longer as the Blessed One, even though this was a process that was already going on. So as we've seen already in the 8th century was the last time that Muhammad was used as a title for Jesus. The new Arab rulers were anti-Trinitarian Christians, and by the 9th century, the anti-Trinitarian Christianity had evolved into a new religion called Islam.